talked a lot about the decline of quality in tech, and a lot of people don't understand what you know about technology. So why is quality declining and what can we do about it?
You know, I am so disappointed with where we are in technology in general. From software in 2023 through 2024, there was many AAA releases of games in which you could argue they weren't complete. And how many products do you buy that you end up having to return for a glitch, or they weren't tested and you're disappointed with what you receive? And at least for me, it seems it's occurring at a much more routine basis that I receive things I don't appreciate because there's something either that they misrepresented, or more importantly, the device doesn't work. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So today I thought I would just do something pretty fun. And I'm doing this with a battery rig because it just allows me to be flexible. So over here for the camera, I have what's called a USB tester. And these are pretty inexpensive. You can get them for like 25 bucks. They're from China, and it's a pretty nifty little tool. Now, what this tool does is it is showing me right now what this battery is outputting, and it is showing me what the cable is doing between the battery and my iPad. And it allows me to see if the cable is actually doing what it says it's going to do. By the way, you have a little screen and you have a little button you can press. And when you press the button, it can tell you things like, does this device have screens available? And so this device can actually support 2 screens. So it tells me that. And it's showing me that the cable is announcing to the iPad that it's compatible to do those tasks. And now it's showing me, for example, the amount of actual percentage of time deviation and the voltage, because there's always a dither in voltage. A dither means things oscillate because of interference and frequency, so you want to be able to measure that. And this device measures all the subtleties of the cable. There is nothing left to uncertainty. Now, the reason this is so important is when you get a USB cable, and today, because of the European Union, we're all supposed to be using USB cables, right? I got this one here. I got one of my favorites here called a chunky cable. This is the chunky cable. Kim, I'm gonna let you be cable woman here. You're gonna get to have all these beautiful cables. Here's one of my favorite cables. This cable is my favorite because it does something. It allows me to go into old-fashioned USB outlets and USB-C. It also allows me to go to USB-C or to Apple products. And it's also a data cable, meaning that these items fully transfer all of their capability to the main cable. So this cable is very versatile. So if you happen to have Apple devices and USB-C devices and you just want to have one cable, this is amazing. And there's no plastic up here. This is metal, so it will actually last a long time. So that's a data cable and also a charging cable. And this cable I'm going to give her right now that I showed you originally, this is an 8K cable, and I've tested this cable, and this cable is one of the best cables I actually got. And it's a generic cable of all things. It actually passed all the tests. And here is another expensive cable that was supposed to be an 8K cable, and this thing didn't pass any of its tests, and this was twice as expensive as the previous cable I just showed you. And then you've got this white cable that comes with products. Usually you can tell if they're really inexpensive cables because they have writing on the actual sleeve of the cable, which usually means these are very inexpensive. Well, again, this is purely a charging cable. You can't attach anything but a charger to this because there's only 2 lines in here. So this cable is useless for transferring any files from a phone or a product. And now finally, we get to one of the more famous cables, the Apple new USB-C cable. So you would think that if Apple produced a cable and it gave it to me for this iPad, which is an iPad Pro M4, you would expect that the cable would be able to actually transfer information at the full speed the iPad is capable of and actually charge the iPad at full speed. But in fact, this cable is an average cable. It doesn't transfer at the maximum speed possible. And the reason for that is this cable, like every other cable I showed you, has a chip inside it. The chip is more powerful than the computer that was on the lunar module to send people to the moon in the 60s. And this chip identifies to the device it's being plugged into what it's capable of doing between the cable and the device, and of course where the device is being plugged into, interrogates the charger, whatever it's being plugged into, and then they make a happy little union. And that's how we get our cables to work. So this is my real point of why I wanted to explain this to you. The decline in quality. If you go to Amazon and you buy a high-end cable, let's take this guy right here. This is the most high-end cable right here, this 8K cable. This cable is going to be shown with 5 or 6 other cables. In actual fact, since I bought all of them, this was the only cable that actually was able to do what I needed it to do. So then I was thinking, how many people have bought a bad cable and then get shocking results from the device they're plugged into, like the camera keeps cutting out, or they have a teleprompter, which was my application because I'm doing these videos now, or whatever, and their device is not working correctly, and it actually comes down to the cable. So Apple made a choice to make a decent data cable that has average speed and a decent charging cable, but they didn't max it out. And I find that kind of a shame that if you buy an expensive iPad, that you can't have a cable that actually does everything the iPad's capable of. But what I want you to really think about is if you are going to be buying cables, you should buy cables, reputable cables. You should spend a little extra money. Belkin and other companies like that tend to have cables that do actually meet the spec. But the problem is Belkin and these companies sometimes don't have that particular unique new cable you might need. And you have to go to the Amazon casino and see if you can find a good cable. So for me at least, and this is the decline of quality, it on average takes me 2 to 3 attempts to buy cables on Amazon to find good cables. That's ridiculous.
So when you're recommending a more expensive cable, let's say I'm shopping on Amazon, how do I know that just because it's more expensive, it's necessarily better quality?
You don't, but I don't expect everyone to be a technologist, and that's the irony of this. So what I've learned is, and by the way, I mean, I would tell you the product name of this, if I could actually pronounce it, it's LDL RUI, R-U-I, LDL RUI. So they made a good cable, but this company could be out of business tomorrow, and this could be just a one run, and they happen to produce a decent cable. But another thing that happens in Amazon is you could get decent products. For me, I did this with hubs, USB hubs. I got a run for my day job where we got some hubs, and we got a run of them, and we had one decent hub, and we had 3 bad ones right out of the box. And again, what can happen is a manufacturer will show Amazon and show the distributor or the outlet, be it Best Buy, a really good product that meets all of the specs. But over time, they start to cheapen the product and they take components out of the product. And Amazon and Best Buy are unaware of the cheapening until it's brought to their attention. That's one of the reasons why it's very important that you be proactive and send these cables back. And the only way I think we get Amazon and these big outlets to realize this is a huge problem is to be proactive and not let them get away with it. And so I hope that people will really be diligent. If your product doesn't work the way it's expected to work, call the manufacturer. A lot of people think that's a waste of time. No, it isn't, because you can ask them what happens if the cable's not to spec, and use their cable if possible. And if you can't use their cable because maybe their cable came with an old-fashioned USB and you only have USB-C, well, then you go to the casino. So that's why I recommend going to a higher quality cable. And unfortunately, there's not a guarantee, but you're more likely to get a winner than if you go with the generics. But it's appalling what the quality control and how bad it is. and how little quality control there is.
Absolutely. And
It's
how
appalling.
do people know how to test it? So you were talking about this device where you can test the different outputs and inputs. Is this something you recommend to people? Because how will the average person know whether or not it's a cable issue or how well the cables are
All
performing?
right. So if I was a videographer, if I was a YouTuber, if I was in technology, I would say today you can't live without one of these. Because,
and that is what?
Which is a USB tester. And I have one with a display. And the reason why you want a USB tester with a display and you want one that will test the full cable is you want to know what you bought. Simply put, I cannot tell what's inside this cable. It's impossible.
Right.
It's the one few purchases that is really, I know this sounds weird, but this cable is more important than most of the time the device. People don't realize it stops interference occurring from what you're trying to do and what your outcome. So the cable is important, and it's always the weakest chain by far and large. So to have bad cables in the mix really makes products appear to be bad. That's why it's a big problem.
Absolutely. And this quality control issue doesn't just apply to cables, obviously. This is what we're seeing with tech in general. And again, the average person doesn't know how to identify the issue. So as a technologist, if someone's not tech savvy, how do we even navigate this market, or casino as you call it, of all these options in tech?
I have been trying to figure that out, and Kim has laughed at me many times when I've told her some of my little stories or horror stories. Well, I've been thinking about this for many years now. And my conclusion is, in the old days, we all would have to go to a store, a retail store. And there was a sales manager that was responsible for the chain. And they would bring in products that they personally would vouch for. And I remember working in a computer store where the sales manager insisted that every product that was in his store be tested. So we could have vendors come in and show the sales manager the product, and he would test it. He would have our engineers come and test it. And we wanted to make sure that what we were putting an ad out on was actually real. And we used to do that. So I think that since we've now gone to, by far and large, really internet consumerism, we have forgotten about that. And because it's no longer transparent, that purchasing idea that you're meeting with someone to actually transact and do a transaction, everything's virtual, no one seems to have the heart or care enough to realize that that quality control is super important. And I don't think Amazon is capable of doing the quality control they need to do, which is, if a product comes back returned, I wonder how many times they would test 3 or 4 more of the products to see if the product genuinely is bad. I don't think they have the time to do it. So ultimately, I think we're suffering from our own genius of building so many products, making it super easy to buy them, super easy to return, and at the same time, allow vendors to game the system because they've already come out with their next revision before they even have to deal with improving the current product.
Right.
And I would say that's the same thing with gaming today. By the time they come out with a AAA game, by the time it's actually bug-free is by the time they're coming out with the next version. So we never really get a good version of anything anymore. We get a pre-trial or a beta version of something. And what's worse, none of us, because we put things on a schedule for profit, and these games and everything have to come out on a time schedule, we have really destroyed craftsmanship. The idea that we care about what we produce. I would argue that Apple today does not feel the same way they do about their products as they did back in the 80s when they were first doing it, because I suspect by now it's routine. The same for Microsoft and the same for all these tech giants. And you know what? In my job, the same thing occurred to me in my career. Was I realized that after a while, you can easily fall into a terrible rut of actually taking everything for granted, just assuming that it's always the norm. But ultimately, we have really dug ourselves into a hole. We've got to figure out a way now to make products that are sustainable, meaning that you can replace batteries and parts when they break. If we have the technology to make this ultra thin iPad, perhaps we have the technology to make this iPad just a little less thin, but allow us to change out components. Oh, I forgot though. No one wants to do that because that means we won't be buying as many products. And capitalism is based on Consumption.
Right. So I think another issue is that everyone's playing the lowest price game. So you go to Amazon and there's tons of overseas vendors competing for the same cable at the lowest price. As a consumer, we don't know the difference. Another aspect is something we talked about. We used to have in-person stores with product managers that would manually check and verify. This technology and the ability to access it virtually has almost removed that human touch from the verification and quality control.
Absolutely. I just saw this year more YouTube videos of people trying to put together a gaming rig. So they have to order all these parts. And they're talking about getting motherboards that have already been used or getting defective parts or parts that have been damaged in shipping. But the most important part of this, and this was the interesting part of the video exercise, is not their stories. It's actually their sentiment that they're alone. They don't feel supported. Tech support doesn't know enough in many cases, and everyone feels like they're faking it. They're doing it for the very first time. And what I find horrible is that if you say thousands of dollars to build something, and then you get it and all the parts are suspect, and then you are now spending not just your money, but you are being ripped off by someone else who has skated on some spec or something. And I find it just so unfair, because what is your recourse? Because you're not a computer engineer. You're not going to be able to really determine what's wrong. You just hope it works. So then you return everything. And I've seen people in a very vicious cycle of returning things, and then they give up and they just basically said, no, I never built that because it was too hard. That happens more often than people are willing to admit. And how many people have computers and things in their homes that they've given up trying to maintain?
Absolutely.
Tons.
Absolutely. And there's so many cheap options. Why would I spend all that time and frustration to try to fix it if I'm not a technologist, when I can just buy another cheap one?
Going back to the cables, I just realized that if I'm doing a new project, there's going to be, a shrinkage budget, which is in retail the term of things just disappearing. Well, for me, the shrinkage budget is the amount of manufacturers that are actually lying about their specs, meaning I have to try out boxes because I can't trust what I'm actually reading. That actually occurred when I was putting together my new network, my new lab, when I moved here to Dallas, and several boxes just didn't meet the specs they were advertising. So it's really telling that we're in a world now where, trust but verify is really the only vernacular that you must adhere to. And especially if you're spending your hard-earned money, be prepared to send things back. Don't compromise. It's interesting. Our standards do work if the cables and the devices have all got complimentary handshaking by all the protocols being honored correctly. The chips in these cables, if they are not generic, or I shouldn't say generic, not fake, if they are real chips that have been produced by the USB, there's a whole USB committee, these chips are really good. So the odds of these devices not working as intended should be much less than they are. And one more important factor is that we have the testing equipment now when we're building the cables to make the cables totally tested before they go to market, and all this technology is available. So the fact that we're getting bad cables is a decision. It's not based on it being hard to make.
Oof. That kind of sums up this whole thing, right? Companies are willing to sacrifice their credibility by competing on price. It leaves consumers in a pretty helpless state. So what are some of the recommendations? You recommended these for testing wires. What about other types of devices, or even things like headphones and other tech?
Well, it's interesting. Headphones is a much more nuanced space because people's ears are all different, and I would never go into a headphone space of what's a good headphone or a bad. But let's talk about a really good space. Let's think about this for a second.
So podcasting's big. There's microphones.
Right, microphones.
Setups.
Well, but I was going to think of something more to do with, let's talk about appliances. Today in America, you have more choices for appliances, but what people are unaware of is most appliances, especially because of the EU and because of green mandates, were mandated to actually reduce the weight of machines. And by reducing the weight of standard appliances, we've actually made them inferior, and they do not last as long. And the average appliance now lasts 5 years. You can get a Speed Queen that will last 20, and it's twice as much money, and it's twice as much weight. So basically, it's not as environmentally friendly, but since I don't have to build 2 machines in the same period of time, it beats the machine that I have to build twice. Now, what's interesting is we always seem to get things wrong when we're trying to improve our technologies, because we have policymakers who think, ooh, I'm going to be green, so I'm going to suggest that we can make appliances lighter and we can make them more energy efficient, and industry will figure it out. But sometimes we're forcing conclusions that are not possible. And we do this often. And then what happens is the consumer's caught in the crossfire. And a lot of the reasons why our products aren't the same as they used to be is environmentalism and reducing packaging, reducing shipping costs, reducing weight, and then finally using computers to basically design products with the least amount of materials in them to save every single nickel, dime, and penny. So when you're trying to save every penny and you're willing to take shortcuts, it means you're going to leave a resistor or a capacitor out that might make the product more impervious to a short or a surge. You might harden your ribbon cable on like Apple laptops so the cable doesn't break. You might make a Surface laptop that Microsoft made have a detachable battery in some form so the whole Surface doesn't become obsolete when the battery goes dead. And if you're going to take the battery out, it is almost impossible to take the screen off without breaking the screen. So you ultimately need a new screen if you're going to replace the battery. Again, and the whole idea is, well, you need a new laptop after 3 years. Do you? Do most people today need more power than they had 3 years ago to surf? Do most people need more power today other than gamers who need a more enhanced graphics card and eventually might need a new rig? But that's 5 to 7 years, not 3. And unfortunately, everything seems to be designed to fail within 3 to 5 years. And I think that's too short. And I think things should be fixable. And I think then we could make more products if things were fixable that were cool. And we could come up with innovations to add on to those products. And we could be nice to planet Earth, and we could be nice to our pocketbooks. And at the same time, we could invent things that people want to buy. And that's how it should work. But unfortunately, in this reality, consumerism means that products have to die. And it's obvious that's how they're being designed.
Absolutely agreed.
I mean, does everyone know the light bulb? Just really quick, because I've covered this on the radio show I do, but the light bulb thing is funny. Back in the 20s, a whole bunch of light bulb manufacturers got together, or was it 30s, doesn't matter, back in that era. And they decided that light bulbs are lasting too long because light bulbs never die.
Yes.
So they all went to work and got all of their engineers and chemists, etc., to try to design a light bulb that would die at a prescribed amount of time. It took more research and development to do that than to develop the light bulb, but they did it.
Wow.
And then they quietly had everyone adapt the same standard. And that's how they created the idea of the razor blade, the perishable item that has to be replaced all the time.
Right.
And so if the light bulb was done that way, let's not even talk about our cars and everything else, our tires. I am sure that our rubber tires could perhaps last a little longer. I can go on and on. But I guess that's why capitalism works, because we create consumerism. I think where the folly is, I think we've accelerated capitalism too far. And I think we need to slow it down. And I'm not against capitalism, but I am against folly. And we do need to be real. We need to consume less, do more with what we've got, and be more ingenious with creating products people want.
Absolutely agreed.
That's my perspective.